Mess up there. Yeah, I'm not anything.
It's all right.
It's all on. We're on.
Crec que podem començar.
I think we can start now. Hello to one and all, and welcome. Welcome to Festival 42, this festival here in Barcelona, celebrating its fourth edition, and hopefully it's going to be just the fourth of a long list. Thank you very much to all of you for being here to speak about monsters, steampunk, and thanks to the author for being with us. I'm a total fan of your work, so I am thrilled, I am super happy of having the opportunity of discussing with you, engaging with you, and opening this debate about your work. In case you don't know him, let me start with a brief presentation. He is a speculative fiction writer from the US and also from the Caribbean. He he grew up in the context of supernatural, and he found the need of opening the sources and also the kind of characters. So he decided to get hands-on, and the result of this is a long list of works, such as a reinterpretation of the Ku Klux Klan, for example, the powers of a godness, combining Africa and America, amongst many others. He has received the Nebula and Locus Awards, and he is also a finalist for the World Fantasy Award. How are you? How are you doing?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you. Great to be here.
Volia començar.
So I would like to start this debate, this panel entitled Major Monsters and Racial Denouns. I would like to start asking you about your name, which is a literary name, right? To somehow make a difference between your academic career and your literary career. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes. I decided to create a name, a literary name, so people would not confuse it with my academic name, because I'm a historian, an academic historian. That's what I do at my day job. I decided to come up with a name based on three words. The first one, Fenderson. That is the name of my grandfather, so that was my grandfather's first name. I took my mother's maiden name, the name of her father, which is Clark, and so that's how you get P for Fenderson in Clark. And then the middle name, Djèlí, the D is silent, so it's just Djèlí, and a Djèlí is a West African storyteller. Some of you may know the term. This was someone like a bard to the king or a noble, and they would be able to tell generations of stories and tell various stories. And so put it all together, you get P, Djèlí Clark. So that's how that name came about. And also my actual name is Dexter Gabriel. So my pen name sounds nothing like it, except for my middle name. My father's name was Joseph, and my middle name, I'm named after him, is Joey, like a baby kangaroo. And so Djèlí and Joey kind of sound alike. And so that's how I came up with it. Yeah.
Molt bé.
Thank you. So one can find perhaps an homage to your roots and also perhaps to the work you're carrying out in your work. So I would like to underline that part of your work is ambience in histories, in alternative histories from the past. I think I'm not mistaken when I say that you are an avid reader. Also, when did you decide to get hands-on, and you told yourself we need more diverse stories with more diverse sources?
Yeah, I always say if there's anybody who's a writer out there who wants to be a writer, you need to read a lot. You cannot write unless you read, as far as I'm concerned. And it takes a special kind of egomaniac who decides, after doing a lot of reading, like I did, oh, I think I can do this. And I decided, because I'm a bit of an egomaniac, that I would try writing. And so my earliest stories were, and all writers are probably familiar to this, they were the stories I wrote for my sister when I was a kid, for my parents, for my cousins. That's who I wrote stories for. And it wasn't until I was grown, out of college, out of university, that I decided, oh, I think I could write for other people. And maybe they want to read the things I wrote. And it turns out some of them did, so I was lucky. So that's when I decided to do it, yeah.
Molt bé.
Thank you. Part of your work, amongst which I would like to underline Ring Shout, translated by Raúl García Campos, and in Catalan by Martí Salas, The Black God's Drums, edited into Spanish, and other books that compose the Djèlí universe. Well, this work is characterized for combining social issues, racial issues, mythology, magics, monsters, in various steampunk universes, so to speak. So what are the pros or the advantages of revisiting the past and creating alternative stories through speculative fiction, which is somehow in between fantasy and science fiction?
That's a good question. I always say that, and I say this because I'm a historian, so I'm biased, but I always say that all science fiction fantasy is based on history. I don't care if you're telling, you're George R. R. Martin and you're doing the far-flung past, you're going to create your Game of Thrones. It's based, on your ideas of a medieval Europe or a medieval world, or if you're Tolkien, if you're doing modern works, or if you're doing the far-flung future and you're Frank Herbert creating Dune, you're still pulling on some aspect of human history, because the only histories we know of are human histories, right? The dolphins have not shared their histories with us yet. And so the aliens have not visited us to tell us their histories. And so the only thing we have to pull from to understand the human experience are the multiple histories that humans have. And so when I go looking into history, I may be doing it more directly, right? Whereas they are doing it a bit indirectly, but all of us as creators, as writers, we're playing around with history. And so for me, there is a certain interesting liberty, especially as a historian, to play around with alternate histories, because it's not so much I get to imagine what would history be like if this one little thing changed. And I think that may be the fun part. But actually the part that interests me as the historian is whenever I see a story and they've changed something in history to make the world an alternate world, I always want to know, why did they choose that part in history to change? And one of my theories is that all alternate history stories really want you, as a reader, to think about that moment in our history that they changed, because they're trying to say that moment is very important, right? There's something about that moment in our history that you need to know more about. And I'll tell you this fantasy story about what it will be like alternatively, but I'm hoping that when you're done, you think about that moment in history that changed in our history. And I always say all alternate histories are really about our history. They're just trying to get you to see it a bit differently. And so, yeah, I think it's the same thing. When I was writing A Master of Jinn, I'm talking about colonialism. Mm-hmm. I want people to think about colonialism and the scramble for Africa and these things, even while they're having fun, thinking about Jinn and magic and all these things. I want them to think about that. The Black God's Drums, I'm talking about the Haitian Revolution. I want people to think about the Haitian Revolution and its importance, even while I'm telling all these fantastical stories. And so, yeah, that's the sneaky part. As historians, we're trying to teach you some history when we write alternate histories.
Sí, i ho fas de manera divertida.
Yeah, and you do it in a very fun way. You combine very difficult topics with irony and an amazing sense of humor that one can find in all your work. And I think this is very characteristic of your work. I had a question about the use of irony and the sense of humor. I cannot imagine reading one of your books without having these elements present. What role do you think irony plays in your work?
Yeah, I mean, irony and humor, right? Like all human beings like to laugh. It's universal. And so now what we laugh at might not be universal, but we like to laugh. And to me, especially if I'm dealing with heavy topics, like I have a book where it's the Klan, right? If I just talk about the Klan, people walk away like, well, that was depressing. And so, yeah, I show that there's some fun in there. The characters are joking. There's a part where even though they're fighting the Klan, they go out and they are at a bar and they're drinking and they're dancing. Because that's human life, right? We're often fighting against something. It looks like we're going to be fighting against a lot of things in the U.S. soon. But we also live life, right? We do all the different things. We go out and like to eat food, we drink wine, we have sex, and we do all those things. And so I try to imbue that even within serious topics because I think it's a way to make the books accessible, that people want to read it, but I also think it's a human thing. I think that when we're writing and we're creating, we have to remember that even when we're talking about deep, profound things, that these are still humans that are going to have moments where they're trying to enjoy the life that they have, and they're going to try to carve out spaces of time and places where they can enjoy themselves and have fun. And so, yeah, I think that's just, to me, that's part of story writing. The other secret part of story writing, and you heard me say this, is food.
Yes.
Right? Think about food. You're probably thinking about now, what am I going to eat later? What am I? Like think about how much time we spend thinking about food, and then when we sit down to eat, we spend talking about the food and talking to people while we're eating food. If you're doing writing and you're not putting food in there, you're missing out. Food is big, right? And so food, people say, what's the secret of writing? Food. You need it to write, and make sure you're putting it in your writing. That's my lesson.
Molt bon consell.
Thanks, this is an amazing piece of advice. So even if your universes are ambience in the past, let me now pull the thread of a topic you mentioned earlier. You raise very contemporary topics such as the impact of colonialism, racism, the impact of slavery, the feminist revolution. So do you think that your work could be also considered as retrofuturistic, combining the past, the present, and the future?
I like that, retrofuturistic. Yeah, I mean, certainly. Part of what I do with my books, I know there's a quick question like, should science fiction be political or not? All sci-fi is political, right? I always say, like, people say they don't want politics in their Star Wars. Star Wars is about space Nazis. Of course it's political. It's literally about people fighting space Nazis. How can it not be political? And so, yeah, all science fiction I say is political. It depends on how much you want in it and what your politics are. And so I put the things that I find interesting in my science fiction. And so, yeah, I want to talk about those issues. It's almost natural to talk about those issues to me. Like some people are you thinking about, did you put this? I said, no, it's what goes on in my head. So it ends up on the paper. And so, yeah, I think those issues are important. I like bringing them up, even if at times with humor. I throw a lot of modern terms. Like I'll have some of my characters. That's a little trick I do. I like to have my characters speak like they live in the 21st century. So they'll sometimes say things. People are like, nobody back then would talk like that. Well, will you even stop me and come in and stop me from writing it? No. And so, and so I think that's a way. Again, another way. Maybe that's me as this history teacher. That's a way I get people to access it if I have a character speak a certain way. So I have a book that. I just wrote The Dead Cattail Assassins, which is going to be published. And I have a point where I have these goddesses in there. And, you know, when you read a book, your goddesses should sound like thee, thou, and all of this. And my goddesses speak Jamaican patois, because why not? Right? Why can't they? And so, yeah. And so I like bringing different elements, whether it's history, culture, and what have you, to the stories, because I find them fun. Yeah.
Sí, jo són molt de...
And they are indeed fun. While reading Ring Shout, which is about the monsters that provoke a terrible hate, such as the members of the Ku Klux Klan's kind of hate. So I had the feeling that through literature and through this book, one can somehow do some historical justice or revenge through literature. Sorry, do you agree?
Yeah, look, it's, I guess the word for it is cathartic. It makes you feel good to write about several black women beating up Klan members. I mean, how does that not make you feel good? And so, so definitely, yeah, there's definitely an element of catharsis there. But yeah, at the same time, I think, look, we can't go back and change history. History is history. There's no way to do that. And so there is a little escapism in doing so. But it's also making people think about the time you live in. And if you had to, you can't go back and change things. But if you live during a time where you have to fight these things, how would you fight it? Are you thinking about fighting it and so forth? How do you resist it? And so there's also that element in it with the understanding is, as much as I love these works and they're escapist, history is not you can't undo it. We haven't created time machines. We probably shouldn't. And so we can't undo these things. And so some of it is, I do ask people to think about, however, if you lived in their shoes, would you be these heroines? Would you have that ability to react these ways and resist in this way? Yeah.
And I would like to stop now for a second and speak about your process, your creation process, because of course I'm very curious about it as an editor, even if all your work, or at least what I've read until now, are somehow within the same genre. Each one of them has a very different universe, one from the other, comparing one from the other. So you source your inspiration from different mythologies, different historical sources. So for example, in the Black Gods drums, you include Yoruba's inspiration from Nigeria, or for example, in the Dead Jinn universe, we find references to the Islam, and in Ring Shout, you focus on the terror provoked by the KKK. So when developing these universes, what is your process? Do you choose first the location, and then the historical source, the topic, the monster? Tell us more about it.
Those are good questions. So my stories always interestingly start off with characters. And so sometimes I see the characters in my head. And so for A Master of Jinn, the Jinn universe, I saw the main character Fatma in my head, wearing the suit, the bowler, cane, staring up at the dead Jinn. And the story got written from there. In some ways, I may have the ideas, they're just ideas floating around, but they're not fully formed until I sit down and I start writing. And so my process is to think about the story for a long, long, long time. I think with Ring Shout, I thought about that for maybe 2 years, just in my head. I hadn't written down anything. I would just think about it. In the US, you're doing a lot of driving. So I think about when I'm driving or while I'm washing the dishes or something of the sort. And I think it was about a year and a half later that I decided to write down notes. But I sat with the story. Not all stories are like this. Sometimes I think about it within like a week and I just do it. But I sat with Ring Shout so long that when I wrote Ring Shout in 5 weeks, right? Because I'd been sitting with it for 2 years. So it's going to take another 2 years to write it, right? So I've been sitting with it so long that by the time I started writing down notes, which is like about maybe a few weeks before those 5 weeks, I had pretty much written down, I knew where the whole story was going with only a few surprises. And so that's often my process. For longer stories, I have to sketch them out a bit. I wrote A Master of Jinn over a summer. Yeah, and I was over a summer where I was traveling because I was doing a lot of historical conferences and research. So I was in Barbados. There was a time I was in Havana, Cuba. I was in a hotel, and I wrote a ton of chapters sitting up in this hotel in Havana, writing a lot of it. And then when I came back to the States, I wrote the rest. And so yeah, it's there's a process of getting the idea, and then you start writing the story. And even though I know what the story is going to be, the story starts taking its own twist and turn. Mm-hmm. New characters get created. In Ring Shout, for instance, Sadie was not a character who was in my original draft. Yeah, she just she appeared as I was writing. And
Wow.
thank goodness, because she's my favorite character from the
Sí.
story. And so, you have stories where things like that happen. And then, of course, there's research, because I'm doing history. And, research can take time. I always say you can spend hours doing research because you want to find out what kind of wine someone in 15th century Valencia drank with this perfect food, and you'll spend hours and researching on Google. You have 100 Google tabs open, and then after you spend all that time, you just write down the word wine. So that's how research can go. But in between that time, it was about the friends you made along the way during the research.
So you've been exploring cosmologies and mythologies, which I dare saying are closer, let's say, to you. But would you dare exploring cosmologies and mythologies which are, let's say, farther away from from you?
Yeah, I mean, if I can understand them. There are some, for instance, I think there are some cosmology mythology I'm just not familiar with, and so I tried to familiarize myself. So in doing a Master of Jinn, for instance, I tried to familiarize myself a lot with, for instance, Islam within Egypt, within a certain time period, like within the late 19th, early 20th century, within how people would think about dress, about certain thinkers of the time. I read of certain understandings, like for instance, Islam is not the same religion worldwide, and so how it would be experienced within Egypt by certain different sects and by different communities would be different. In one of my stories, for instance, I also bring in non-Islamic communities in Egypt during that time. So, for instance, I bring in Armenian communities within Egypt, Christian Armenian communities, or local Judaic communities, and so that took research to find that out. But I mean, that to me is part of any time you're writing. I mean, as much as I'm not a practitioner, for instance, of Voodoo or Santeria or Candomblé, so I had to research for that. I always say when I wrote The Black God's Drums, I've never been a 13-year-old black girl who lives in New Orleans, and so I had to research that. And so, yeah, everything takes a bit of research. You're always stepping out of yourself to write, even though all your characters, let's admit it, authors, all our characters have a little piece of us in it. We still have to step outside of ourselves to write. So I think it's always a matter of doing so. And yeah, there are certain challenges, certain places I'd love to go that I haven't yet, and who knows?
Molt bé.
Thank you. So what are your literary references? What are the must read for you that you always have in your bookshelf? What authors, let's say, inspire your work or are present in your work?
I have my older authors. There are people like I just read. I call it my comfort food. And so like Wheel of Time, I read those books, even though they have a lot of problems. It's funny, you read books when you were younger and you were like, oh, I love this book. And you go read them when you're older. Wow, this is a little weird. Anybody's read Robert Jordan books, there's like, oh, there's a lot of empowerment of women. Oh, also men spank women, and not in a sexual way, in a way to discipline them, which I did not notice when I was reading when I was 14 and 15 years old. And so there are a lot of older authors who you read and you like them again, but you're like, I'm not going to recommend it, but I will read it. And so, yeah, I think there are certain authors like that. There were authors, I think, who, when I was much younger, like people like Ursula Le Guin, I think was Madeleine L'Engle's works were always a big inspiration. But so were writers like, I think we're talking today with the journalist Toni Morrison, for instance, who I didn't always think of as speculative fiction, but now I think about so much as speculative fiction. People like Octavia Butler, who I didn't discover until I was much older. Because I'm of an age where I'm older, I grew up in the 80s, and her books just weren't around in the US like that. I didn't experience Octavia Butler until I was in college. When a professor said, you like science fiction, did you? I said, I've never heard of this person. And so I read my first Octavia Butler book in college, but, and then I love TV shows. Like, I saw the old Dungeons and Dragons cartoon that they had somebody had outside. I used to love that. I loved, like, The Never Ending Story, all those things. And so I would say all those things are inspirations, and they all end up in my books. Then you have modern writers like, N.K. Jemisin or Victor Laval, Cassandra Caw. These writers, I think that, Ted Chiang, who's here, others who I read their works, and I would say they're my modern inspirations, or those older ones, but these are the ones who are like, really got me thinking and really got me on the path of, I think I want to be a writer now. And then, you draw an inspiration from everything. If anybody wants to ask me one day, there's a way that when I was writing Ring Shout, there's a scene in Ring Shout that was very much inspired by the great intellectual prowess of a Peppa Pig cartoon. Yeah, Peppa Pig was an inspiration for a whole scene in Ring Shout. Because inspiration can come from everywhere, so why not Daddy and Mommy and George and Peppa?
Ara, crec que després d'aquesta...
So after this panel, I'll rush and reread the scene right away. I can't wait. Oh my gosh, I can't wait. So there's something I would like to highlight in your work. So irony, the sense of humor are present in the majority of your books, and I believe one has to highlight the central role of women, racialized women, black women, who oftentimes are the central part of the plot. For example, in we have Anne Mary, Madame Juve. In Ring Shout we have Maurice, Shady, she's so cool. Molly, Anna Jean. So, do you think it is important for them to be there and for them to be claimed as women of action, even if they come from the past?
Yeah, certainly. So, it's interesting for Ring Shout, I didn't know at first that my main characters would all be women, but as I started I knew Maurice, certainly. I had Chef, and I knew that I wanted to make Chef this fighter from World War I. And at first, I had thought, well, she could be, because she's a soldier. I was actually leaning towards, I wasn't even thinking more, but I was just, she'll be a male soldier. But then I started thinking about the other characters. I was like, I don't want a dude messing up this vibe. I was like, it's like I have this group of women. I didn't want to insert this male voice into it. And then I was like, why not just make it that it's a woman who dressed and pretended she was a man and got into the war. And people were like, well, that's unrealistic. I said, well, one, that actually happened quite a lot in history. It's not unknown. And two, well, I'm writing it, and I have clan monsters. So if I want to have a woman soldier, and I have a woman soldier, who cares? And so, once I had that I knew that I wanted this basic, like this homosocial space of only women to have engage in these conversations. And so definitely that. With other things like a Master of Jinn, for instance, Fatma was just, she created the story, so I always knew there was going to be Fatma. And so, sometimes it happens. I won't say that, it's always this interesting thing on like, why did I choose the characters I choose? And, some of them come from readings, like Fatma's name is taken from a famous Egyptian feminist. Some of them come from, like in Ring Shout, all of the aunties, the Otherworld aunties, are named after characters from one of Toni Morrison's novels. Yeah, I know, making you guys go research. And so, you're welcome. And so, so there's always something inspiration. In the Black God's Drums, Anne-Marie, I have an aunt named Anne-Marie, for instance. And so, sometimes there's, it comes from people I know, but really, it's who fits the characters. And people, I've even got the question, do you have any books with male characters? And it's, I do. I have The Haunting of Tramcar 015. I have others. I'm working on one now. These are the characters that fit these stories, right? And I saw no reason not to make them these characters. I couldn't imagine them as anyone else. Certainly, as I was writing them, though, I was well aware that they were women, and I thought about, let me think about what it's like to be this person in this space at this time. What are they going to deal with? What is their world going to be like? And so I tried to do that, and then I just tried to think of them as complex human beings, right, as I'm writing them, and steering away of, sometimes I find if you don't think about in tropey ways, you don't end up in tropes. Just think of the people as complex human beings, and that's what you'll get. And
Sí.
yeah, and so I hope it worked.
Sí, sí, i tant. De fet, el que tu comentaves abans de...
Actually, what you said before about making reading more accessible, the fact that there are female main characters who speak the way we speak currently, and the fact that they have internal problems like the ones we have now, makes it very accessible. So I think, good job, well achieved.
Well, one of the best compliments I ever had was I went to something, somebody came to a signing, and somebody said, "I thought you were a woman." And I said, "Thank you so much." It means a lot to me.
I wanted to stop for a second to talk about Afrofuturism. For those of you who do not know this term, in the Afro-Descendant Academy, it is defined as a technocultural and speculative philosophy trend, transdisciplinary and pan-Africanist that explores the intersection between the African diaspora, technology, science fiction, and magical realism when conceiving racialized futures and reimagining the past. It's a relatively new term. It's been used a lot lately to group together all of these pieces of work that give a louder voice to black voices and stress the lives of these persons. And I think it's a very broad term. What do you think is the scope of Afrofuturism? What do you think it encompasses?
It's a good question because, I mean, well, thanks to Black Panther, like everybody now uses Afrofuturism, and I go back and forth with the term because I think it's useful in many ways, especially in thinking about certain works, about especially where you had a lot of Afrofuturist writers. So I'll tell this short story. I'm sorry to tell this. I try not to be long, but when I was much smaller, I'm old enough, so I was really small when Star Wars came out, and I wanted to see Star Wars really badly. Star Wars. And my mother said, "No, you can't go see Star Wars." And I said, "Why?" She said, "There's no black people in it." And I was like, "But I can't." She said, "No, what are they trying to say? There's no black people in the future?" She said, "Well, you definitely can't go see it." So I tried to tell her, "Well, no, Star Wars is set in a galaxy far, far away a long, long time ago." And she said, "Well, there were definitely no white people before black people, so you can't see it at all." I didn't understand human evolution, so I had no idea what she was talking about, but I couldn't go see it. So all this to say, I think what Afrofuturism did often came about with this notion that people would ask, are there black people in the future? And that became a big part of it, right? Thinking about these things, about whether or not black people are represented in futuristic settings. And so a lot of Afrofuturism was based on that. And it's done great work thinking about these things. I think like Octavia Butler's work, a lot of her work is Afrofuturist. And you think about people like Samuel Delaney, of course, and others who do these Afrofuturistic works. I've often tried to figure out where my works fit in that, and I thought a term that you use, I think is probably closer, a type of Afro-retrofuturism.
Vale.
Because so you think about like, you think of you think of like the Black God's Drums, which uses steampunk or something like that. Steampunk is inherently futurist yet retro, because it's not a type of science that ever existed. Like nobody can manipulate gravity to do what they do with airships, right? No one can create, they had sentient automatons in many of these steampunk works, right? It's a type of, they can do things that we cannot do, right? You think of like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we have not figured out how to reanimate life or any of these things, right? And so there's a way that steampunk is inherently fantastical and futurist, even though it's retro. And so I think I've often said some of what I do is an Afro-retrofuturism. But then there's other of my works, like I Can't Place Ring Shout. There are certain, maybe in the, what's it good, uses the mask, I have her using like, but there's, like, I don't know how it fits into Afrofuturism, or the works, I have short stories that are simply fantasy. And what happens when Black authors like Charles Saunders or N.K. Jemisin are just doing secondary world fantasies. We're just creating worlds with gods and magic, and there's nothing futurist about it. So we need to have a broader term to encompass the full breadth of Black writers who are doing horror, who are doing a ton of fantasy, which is really big right now. And where, I can't call it futurism. I once told somebody I wanted to write a story with Black characters who all rode dinosaurs. And they were like, "Oh, Afrofuturism." And I was like, "How?" Like I see the afro, I can't get the futurism. And so, yeah, I think it's a great term.
Vale.
I like how I think it's useful. But I think writers like, for instance, Marlon James and others have said, like, we need new terms that can encompass the full breadth because the genre is too large to come up with for Afrofuturism. But I do like it. I understand its importance, certainly. Yeah.
De fet, una...
Actually, my follow-up question was precisely that, whether the term is so big that maybe it needs subcategories or diversifying the term, because I also get the feeling that if we only use this label to group together all these works, we're losing the specificity of each of them.
You're losing, yeah. That I think it also can do things where there was a time when I was writing where people would, where black writers would tell you that people would want the next Octavia Butler story because it could also impact how the industry works because we know how the industry is. The industry is not brave, people. The industry just wants what worked last time. So if Octavia Butler did something, they want you to write the next Octavia Butler book. But maybe you want to do nothing like that. They want you to do something like Jordan Peele did, but maybe you don't want to write something. Maybe you want to write a book with black people and dinosaurs. And, they'll say, well, what's that? I don't have a term for that. How do we market it? And so, yeah, I think that the term, I understand the purpose of the term. I support the term. I can see it's wide encompassing, but I think you're right. I think we need to think about that there are corners that the term is not touching of a lot of black writers who are doing different types of works that may not fit into that. And I think we have to be careful about whether those terms can be applied to everything.
Y una pregunta...
And one more question about Afrofuturism. Do you think that writing speculative fiction, Afrofuturistic or Afro-retrofuturistic, is political in and of itself? Because I think you said so in the first question, it's political. Can you tell us a bit more about why? Because precisely now, in TikTok, there's a whole debate about whether reading should be political or not, or is just escaping, or what do you think about that?
I've already, like I say, where I came down, I think all writers are political. I think all artists, but that's controversial, right? I'm not saying anything that has not been debated and it's not a new debate. I know TikTok may be new, but this is an old debate for anybody who knows who people create, whether art should be for the purposes of some kind of political statement or whether art should just be for the sake of art. Regardless of however the artist creates it, guess what? There's this audience who interprets it. That's why communication works. And people are going to interpret what you write or you create through their own lens, right? And even if you don't intend something to be political, it can be. So like my most recent story, The Dead Cattail Assassins, I intended that story to be fun. Like I've had people ask me, are you trying to say, no, calm down. Just read the story, it's just fun. And yet I cannot tell people there's no politics in there. Just my choice, for instance, as I told you before, to have the goddesses speak Jamaican patois, that can be political, right? This is an insertion of a language that you just don't see in fantasy. And some people are going to be offended by it. I mean, what's this doing here? Talking dragons I can take. I can't take Jamaican patois ever in my fantasy, right? And so, yeah, there's going to be things like that. The cover of the book features this black women with these swords. And I remember as early as 2015, they were still, it was called whitewashing, rewriting the covers of books in the US if it had any character who was not white on it. A Chinese writer had her entire character changed because they said, we can't sell books. This was like 2015, 2016, not long ago. Yeah. And so just having this different person on the cover is political. And so all this to say, as creatives, we may intend our art to just be fun. We may intend it to be escapist. I will argue, if you're writing escapist fantasy, guess what? You're doing political because what are people escaping from? Why do they need to escape? Something must be going on. And so I think that all our works are political, but it's on a spectrum, it's on a scale. Mm-hmm. Not all of it is overtly political. We're not all writing Frank Herbert, Dune. This is definitely about oil wars, and we have giant worms as symbols of various things and what have you, and religious fundamentalism. Not all of it is like that, but I think all of our works, we bring some type of thought. If we think of politics simply as our personal understandings of ourselves and our place in the world, we're bringing that to it. And we certainly can't stop how people are going to read into it, all right? Just to give you, again, a last thing, in The Haunting of Tramcar 015, I have a scene in there, I don't want to give it away, but Armenian candy is very much a part of it. And I imagine an Armenia where the genocide never happened, where there is an independent Armenia much earlier. And I was in France signing books, and someone came up to me, this French Armenian woman, and she had tears in her eyes because she said she'd never thought of a world where the genocide never happened. It just never occurred to her. And after seeing that, she said when she read it, it just seized her up, right? So emotionally. And it just to show you how when I wrote that, I certainly didn't have that depth in it. It was more so a material thinking like, oh, I'll just not have it happen. I did not have that emotional investment in it that she did. But this understanding that something like that, which was just small to me, that it was just a minor part, had a very large impact on her, right? And so this is my lesson to writers. Our words do matter, and creatives, the things we do matter, and even the smallest things we may not be thinking about can have these interpretations that are far and apart what we may have intended. So, just a bit of food for thought.
M'agrada molt aquesta reflexió que fas.
I love your reflection about the Armenian woman you met, because I precisely wanted to segue into the last question with a personal experience. When I read Tramway 015, something similar happened to me, not as big, but I saw the word jeans in the book, and it reminded me of when I was little, and I woke up with scratches because I had scratched myself, and my parents said, no, it's been a Jinn who came and scratched you in the night. So seeing these in The Haunting of Tramcar 015, seeing the stories my parents told me through a book, I don't know, I was very excited to see that. And like you said, it's important. In that sense, the representation in fantastic literature, do you think there's still a long road to cover in terms of representation, or are we there yet?
And thank you for that story, by the way. And that's another thing I think about when people talk, for instance, when Master Jin, people often ask me, I'm glad you asked it to me in cosmologies, because that's how I think. Because people ask me, oh, you're writing about the Jin folklore or mythology. And I'll say, well, wait a minute, there are people who believe in that, right? Just like there are people in Christians, like if I was doing something on angels and they said, oh, you're telling me about the angel folklore. Like that wouldn't be a term that we use because we're around so many other people that are Christian or come from Judeo-Christian faith that we would think of them. And so I often say like, no, I was acting about cosmology or the Yoruba faith. Like there are people who practice those religions. So I'm often careful that I think about not using folklore mythology for living religions. Now, if I'm talking about Zeus, I don't know too many people worshiping Zeus. I'm going to say mythologies, and I'm sorry if I offend folks who might be worshiping Zeus right now. But I think of living religions, I try to use that. But as far as, do we have a ways to go? Yeah, of course. We've come a long ways so far with, with book covers and so forth. But, as recent weird politics, if you keep up with the news shows, history does not just move forward, it can move backwards.
Totalment.
And so it's always a reminder that you're always going to be fighting against those kinds of things. And I think for instance, in the US, you've had a lot more diversity in books, but they did a recent thing on children's books. There are still more children's books about animals or talking inanimate objects like trucks than there are books with children of color, right? Basically what happened was they told a lot of writers that all of their characters are white, so instead of creating characters of color, they're like, I'll have a talking bear, I'll have a talking truck. And so people still didn't go and decide, oh, I'll have children of different backgrounds. And so it just shows you that there's still a lot of work to do. A lot of work has been done. It would not be saying that it's not the same. I go now and I look at books and there's amazing diversity and representation on the books. There's still a lot of work to be done with who's behind the scenes, like who are the editors and everyone else, right? And so, yeah, there's still a lot of work. it will be a work in progress. Less of a destination than a travel as we go along. But hopefully hopefully in some things we move forward with the understanding that things can always move back.
Molt bé. Per últim,
Finally, before we open it up to the room, for those of you who have not read anything that you've written, for those of them who haven't read anything, what book would you recommend they read first? Ring Shout, The Haunting of Tramcar 015, The Black God's Drums. What do you think is your idea book to start?
So I'll go with The Black God's Drums only because The Black God's Drums is a standalone so far. Who knows, I might return to that world. But so you don't have to read anything else. And, Ring Shot might be a little heavy. Folks to start off. And this one might be it's a good way to ease you in accessibility. And then maybe the deal is with The Master of Jinn and the others, you might want to read, because it's a universe, there are several stories. Whereas in both of these are standalones. But I would start off with, I'd do Black God's Drums. But certainly also Ring Shot. I would say just because they're standalones, yeah. But it depends what people want. Some people might want a little horror. Some people might want a little escapist, which I think you can get more in Master of Jinn. So, yeah.
molt bé.
I recommend them all. How's that? That's my answer.
Llegim-vos els tots.
Yeah.
Yes, read them all. Thank you so very much, Anderson.
Torn de preguntes al...
I'll open it up to the room now. If you are... Yes, I see there are many hands raised. People want to ask questions. One over there.
Thank you.
We love hearing you. You just said something, and this was the question I had. So here we go. Would you ever consider writing more inside the universe of the Black God Drums? Because we love those characters.
Yes.
We love the ships. We love everything about it.
Okay.
So.
Thank you. Yeah, that's my answer. No, there's actually a short story. So the world of Black God's Drums is interesting because that world was not supposed to be about the main character. That world was supposed to be about the airship captain, Anne-Marie. I actually have a short story that's never been published, a novelette that is about her. And what happened was I came back to that world and I decided to do it from a completely different character in Jacqueline, right, Creeper. And so I ended up writing that story, and that's the one that got published. But when I first imagined that, I imagined it as a story about Anne-Marie and about her sailing to all these different places and having these adventures, right? And so there's still... I would love to return to that world, but I have so much time. Then I started writing middle grade stuff, and they grow, and so you have to, when you write to kids, you have to write the next one right away. So I'm hoping once I'm done with that trilogy that I'll get to return to some of these other worlds. But yeah.
I just see the column, but I imagine your face.
Yeah, I see the column, so I can imagine you as well.
Thanks. I mean, it's really interesting how you're speaking about history and these kind of mixture of elements. I was wondering, how do you choose to do not be that tough, historically, and not be so soft, to instruct or saying to let people understand, but in a soft and smoother way in the books? Is there a secret formula for that or something?
That's a good question, especially as a historian. So what I don't do is I don't include footnotes. That's a joke. So I don't have footnotes in there, right? Because that to me makes things harder in history if I have to give you a source every time, a citation. And so no, it's I think when you're, especially as becoming a historian, when you're trying to write speculative fiction, I think you have to first and foremost realize you're trying to be a storyteller. And if you try to go too much into the history, you start doing too much, well, now the story is lost and it's not interesting. And I guess perhaps I teach history every day, and so I can tell when my students, their eyes are glazing over and they're thinking about going back to their dorms or doing something different. And so what I try to do when I write, even if I'm using history, is what can I do to hold people's imagination here? Part of it is I throw magic in. That helps. And I throw werewolves and vampires and things, and that certainly helps. And so, yeah, it's a balance. To me, it's a balance as in anything else. It's a balance just like not info dumping when you're creating a world or what have you. And it's just a matter of how do you keep people's attention while you're playing around with this history. But yeah, I don't have a secret formula other than I try to as much as possible realize that I am telling a story first and foremost, and the history is there to help me do so. The point of this isn't to give the people the history. It's not a history book at the end of the day.
Hi ha més preguntes?
Any further questions? Here we go.
Hola, es un placer estar aquí.
Hello, pleasure to be here. A curiosity of Rain Shout. I will not spoil it, it's at the beginning of the book, but Maurice has a weapon, the singing sword, and the way in which she invokes it is like a ritual, and I like it very much. It's like magic. And I understand, or what I would like to know is your inspiration for this weapon. Maybe a myth, or maybe secretly it comes from Japanese anime. There's not much representation of color in anime, but it was this doubt and curiosity, if it's not an uncomfortable question for you.
It's not an uncomfortable question. I love that sword. And the sword, so it's given away, so I'll tell people. So the sword, she calls up the sword, and the sword itself will simply like appear, like it's like almost like oil, and she then has this black sword, and it's based on this ritualistic sword from West Africa. But it's funny you say like anime. Much like anime, I love first of all, the idea comes from my love of magic weapons. I just done a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. I love magic weapons. I love a weapon that just appears, that comes out of nowhere. That's the best kind of weapon. It just shows up when you want it. It's not a cumbersome. You gotta know, where do I put it? You don't have to put it on your back. Like, that's useless, by the way. I know we love doing it in Dungeons and Dragons, but the times it takes you to pull your sword off your back, some guy's already hacked you to death 4 times. This is a terrible place to pull a sword from. You'll cut yourself on your neck. It's terrible. And so I like the idea of a sword that just shows up. And it's funny, like anime, what do we also have in anime? Swords that are far too big for the skinny person to hold. And so also her sword is ridiculously big, but somehow because it's magical, she can still use it. So there was certainly a lot of anime inspiration. And what I did was I blended my own way about it so it has to do, I don't want to give it away, but it has to do with slavery. Like the sword itself is called up by these various spirits, and it has to do a lot with those who engaged in slavery. These West African kings who engaged in slavery were kind of tied to the sword. And I like the idea of spirits being tied to swords. And so it's often hard to remember where things come from, but I do know this. Has anybody ever read Books of Malazan? Anybody ever read Books of Malazan? There's a character in there named, I'm going down the weeds here, Animander Rake. And he has a magic sword that has spirits tied to it. And I don't know when I think back if I was reading that at the same time, but I think of Animander Rake's swords now because it's also a sword that appears, it has spirits tied to it, and this one does as well. And so maybe that was partially the inspiration that was coming about. But yeah, certainly I was thinking about anime and other things when I was thinking about the sword. So yeah, that's a great part of it. And so it's a little bit of everything. Just like that song by Peppa Pig. That's inspiration can come from everywhere. Yeah.
Em sembla que hi havia una pregunta allà.
I think there was a question over there. Yes. I wanted to ask about the main character of how to raise a kraken in your bathtub, because sometimes he has a good time and sometimes he has a tough time. So I wanted for you to talk to us about whether we can learn from his mistakes somewhat.
I didn't expect to hear that story here, How to Raise a Kraken in Your Bathtub is named. I don't know if people have read that short story. I don't know if it's been translated here, but that is a very political short story. A short story I didn't expect a lot of people to read, but it's actually done well. It's been nominated for awards and things. It didn't win the Hugo, but got nominated. I'm a 4-time Hugo loser, but I get nominated. So yeah, what can you say? And so, yeah, that story was interesting. And I say this because, for one, the story was very much inspired by Jules Verne. The story, if anybody's read the story, it's very much a story inspired by Jules Verne's and the character of Captain Nemo, who I didn't realize until I was much older, even though I don't know if I'd read the book, but I'd seen the movies, it's supposed to be a prince from India. And so the story is actually supposed to be the story about this prince, and the reason he has the submarine, the Nautilus, he's trying to stop colonialism and the creation of machines and industrialization. I was like, what? Jules Verne, what are you talking about? Right? So I actually was in Nantes, so I got to go and see the Jules Verne place and everything. And so the story was really inspired, but the main character, he's not a good guy, right? It was one of the first stories I ever written where the character is not a person you root for. And I didn't know how it would go because people normally like my characters, but he's actually this really bigoted Englishman, 19th century Englishman, who, you know, he gets his comeuppance, as they would say, right? He ends up, things don't go well for him. But certainly writing him was a bit of a challenge because I knew that people weren't going to like him. And some people wanted to like him. And yeah, he has a tough time. And you find yourself, though, and it just has the empathy, it's for a small second you find yourself kind of rooting and hoping it turns out well for him. And then you're like, well, no, it shouldn't, because he's really a bad person. But it was really it was really an instructive lesson to me that even terrible people are people, and that it's human to feel empathy for them, even if you don't like the things they do. They're still other human beings, and you know, at the end, you're like, oh well, that happened. But there are these moments where you try to root for him, and you know, it was like an experiment when I was writing, and it was a challenge. But yeah, I like the story, and so yeah, he's probably the most interesting character I think I've ever written, only because he's so unlikable. Thank you for that.
Em sembla que no tenim...
I think we are running out of time for questions. I apologize if someone had a burning question, but well, thank you all very much for coming to listen to Fenderson. Thank you so very much for being with us, Djèlí Clark. And I would like to remind you that he will be signing outside, so if you have books or you want to buy books, now would be the time. Thank you so very much.